All right, so today we'll talk about a reducer pattern. We are in the middle of the state management section. We talked about context API, how to use context API, what it is. Today we're going to talk about reducer patterns. So in the introduction, it says the difficulty of storing and efficiently performing logic on data within components becomes more and more apparent as the amount of data increases. Consequently, as the components grow and deal a larger set of data, the storing and transportation of a state across entire application increasingly becomes more and more cumbersome as well. Reducers offer one possible way to address the problem within the components. So at the end of today, you should be able to explain what immutability is in programming languages, and demonstrate the benefits of immutability, describe reducer functions, and also employ UseReducer hook to manage state in component. So we're going to learn a new hook today. But before we do anything, we need to understand immutability. What is immutability? Immutability is, in a simple language, it's something that does not change. It's the opposite of mutable, something that changes. In programming, you want to keep things away from changing. You don't want things to change by themselves. You don't want to directly change things. There's a lot of emphasis in basically copying whatever you want to change and then changing the copy instead of the original. There's emphasis in that. The reason for that is if you change the original content or the original state, let's say in React, then you're going to have a problem, because in the future you're not going to know what was the beginning, what was the start of your state, what was the start of the change. So it's important to keep copies of everything. There's actually a whole JavaScript framework that was built around this idea of immutability. So in programming, you want to keep things not changing. You want to copy things. So in that case, there's actually an article that I linked here that talks about in detail what the immutability idea is. It talks about something called reference and value. So let's quickly talk about what the reference and value is in JavaScript. I'm going to use a REPL. I'm going to create a new REPL. We're just going to quickly talk about basically the idea of value on reference in JavaScript. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to put here immutability, and then we're going to talk about reference, and versus we're going to talk about something called primitive. I think you've learned primitive when we were learning data types. So in data types, the data types we have, you learned at the beginning were basically things like number, string, number, boolean, boolean, and things like that, right? So these are primitive. So let's say if we say let num is equal to 5, and then in here we go down and we say let's say let new num equal to num. Okay, so in here we're expecting basically new num to just be num. So we could just console log it and console log new num, and also let's console log num. It should be exactly the same, right? Because you basically kind of like set into the value of new num is just basically 5, right? So and if we change that, if we actually change the new num and we say something like new num, and we say increase by 1. So if we say increase by 1, and we console log again new num and num, Now we're expecting now new num to add 1 to num. So if we console log again, your new num is 6, num is 5, right? Because it's going up here and saying, okay, num is 5, I get it. But the next run, so when the JavaScript engine runs, it says a new num. We take a new num and we add in 1. So now new num is 6. So that's a simple way to show that primitive values or primitive data can be directly be changed. So, but there's also something called reference types. Reference types are things like arrays, objects, and functions. At the end of the day, arrays and functions are both objects. So under the hood, they are objects. So we're just going to call them these are all objects, right? So let's just so when I talk about reference type, I'm talking about in here we basically set to a new variable to the old variable, and then you just get the same thing. And now when you change it, you directly change the value of new num. So we're just doing a copy from the old one, we copy into the new one, and then we changing it. So that is direct change. But when it comes to reference types, we're not directly changing it. We're kind of like pointing to a reference in the memory. So let me just quickly create a new object. So I'll call it something like obj, and then I'll say something like a name. I'll write my name here, and then I'll write like hobby, and I would say something like basketball. Okay, so we want to make sure that we want to understand what happens when we do something like this with the objects. So objects are different than a primitive data, right? So now in here, actually, let's understand what happened here. I would love to have some type of drawing. So let me just open my drawing here. So right now what we did was, okay, let's go back. So now what we did was we said const object, we created object. But in JavaScript in memory, what we did was we, let's create 2 boxes here. Oh, sorry. Let's create 2 boxes here. In JavaScript, what we did was we created a so basically we directly create what's going on with this. So let's create 2 boxes. Hopefully you can hear me, Mohammed, right? You can hear me?
Yes,
Okay, good. Okay, sorry, I was talking to someone. Okay, so in here, what we did was right here, this example, object and the name and all that. What we did was JavaScript basically creates a name. So we'll call here a name. So right here, the name. So that would be obj. Okay, and then it creates a value. And then the value would be 5. And then it creates an ID. So this ID will be, you could call it address. So this would be like 1. Okay, so that's what JavaScript does. But then what it does is, let's say we're trying to copy it. Okay, so let me see. So obj. Okay. Oh, sorry. So this is the example for. This is not the right example. So let's just get rid of that. So in value, when it comes to objects in value, it creates a reference. So it does ref, and then it gives you the reference number here. So let's say 2 here. So reference number, and then it gives you here ID, which is basically the ID. So let's call it 1. So this reference basically is going to go in here. So this is going to be somewhere in the JavaScript memory or your computer memory, somewhere. It doesn't matter what it is, whatever that's empty, whatever that it chooses. So in here it says it creates a name. So it creates a name, but a lot of times we don't know what this name is. So it just creates an empty name sometimes. The value would be our object. So this would be the value. So this would be the value. So this would be the object here. So we create like that. And then it will create an ID here. And this would be the reference ID, which is 2, right? So we're referencing this ID right here. And I'm sorry for the colors. ID 2. Now, now when we try to access it, it points to, so this points to here. So this reference is pointing to here, to this ID. And then it says, okay, what is the value of this reference? And then it gives you the value. So that's kind of like how objects work. Whenever you create an object, the value is created somewhere else. And then all you have is just a reference, okay? But so let's say we did what we did before, and we created a new object here. So we say new object is equal to obj. Okay. Now here's where the problem comes. Now basically this new object is also, we can create an example in here. So I'm not sure what color I had. Yeah. So now it's going to create a new box, right? So it's going to say new box, and this box will have the name, and that will be of course new object, new obj. The value would be the reference to. So it will be reference to, right? And then it will have an ID of whatever. So this would be like ID 3 or something like that. Okay, so now the value is being a reference here. So let me just redo the same thing. So now here is referencing here too. Okay, so that's how this is working out. So that's what this is doing. We can console log now. Let's console log obj and a new object. It should let me just get rid of that. So it should have exactly the same thing, right? So it's just basically it's a reference into the same place. So we have the same thing. But what happens if we change the data here? What happens? So let's say we say something like, let's get rid of the console log. Let's say we say something like obj or new obj, okay, that name, and then I change my name to Rana, or let's say I change my name to Muhammad. Okay. So now what happens is the problem now comes is it changes the data. So the reference data changes. So if we console log again, obj and new obj, we run again. As you can see, both data changes. Now that's where the problem with mutability comes. You do not want to change the original. You want to make a copy of it. You want to keep the original. So now we have both. So both are kind of pointing to the same thing. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we made a copy of the original, and then we are basically modifying that copy. So instead of this, what we're supposed to do is we were supposed to do this. So we use a spread operator, which you guys which you learned in React. Spread operator basically copies the original And now if we change the original, if we change the copy, so the new object is a copy. And if we change it, you'll see that when we run again, you'll have Duran Ali or Duran at the beginning. And then the next one, which is new OBJ, you'll have Muhammad. So that's where JavaScript and also mostly in React, that's why we use the spread operator, because we do not want to change the original. That's what you want to avoid. All right, so that's really important to understand. The reference type is that every time you create an object, it doesn't matter what it is, or a array or a function, basically the value of that function or array or object is created somewhere else as a reference. And then we're basically pointing to the reference, the ID, and we're grabbing the value of that, right? So that's the difference. All right, so when it comes to React, basically, React has something called reconciliation. So right here, I don't know how to spell it, reconciliation process, okay? So the reconciliation process is first React components check to see if state or props have been updated, right? Or changed, have been updated or changed. So if that's the case, then it renders the component, right? Renders the component. So if there is a change, then it renders the component. If there is no change, then there is no rendering. And the way kind of like React looks at it is it compares the old state to the new state, right? Or the props, old props, and then it compares to new props. That's kind of like how it does. So yeah, so that's what you want to avoid is basically changing the state directly. So one thing you do not want to do is you don't want to say something like this that state that, let's say, name, and then directly change that to like whatever, you know. You don't want to do that. That is no in React. What you want to do is you want to use the set state, or let's say when it comes to functional programming. So this is a class. So in class, you will say something like this, that set state, and then from there on, you change the state. So set state basically makes a copy of the state, and then it changes with whatever you provide. So it looks for a name, and then it changes to whatever new name here, right? So this is what you want to do. You do not want to do this. This will give you actually an error most of the time. All right, so that in general, that is what you want to avoid. You want to avoid changing the state directly. And also you want to understand that when it comes to objects, they use something called reference type. And if you want to make a change, always make a copy of the object and then change, but do not change it directly. Otherwise, the reference will change. And then, and this creates a new reference actually. So this creates a new reference. So in our drawings, it will be like a new reference here. We'll have a name, and then value would be, so the value would be a new value. So this will create a reference to somewhere else. So this would be like 4, and then it will create another box with a name, and then the value would be the new object. So this would be new object data, and then also it will have an ID. So that's what it does when you use spread operators. Okay, let's go back to our here. Actually, this will be our example today. Let's go back to here. So we talked about immutability, what it does, all that stuff, all the good stuff about immutability. The next thing we need to understand is the reducer function. So reducer function is a special function, and it is a pure function. So when I say pure function, what I'm talking about is basically a function that has no side effect, right? So if we go back to here, our example place, let's just make it bigger. So if we go back here and we say reducer function. Reducer function has to have a two things. Number one is it should it does not let you reference something outside of the function, right? So you cannot reference something outside of function. Example of that would be something like this. So let's say we have a two variables. Let's say 1 is equal to 1, and we have const 2 is equal to 2, and then we create a function here. So we say function something, and then we return 1 plus 2, right? So this will be a problem because now you're referencing something from outside without passing it as a as an argument, or as an passing it through here as an argument. So what do you want to do is you want to pass it as an argument. So you want to say something like a p, and then you want to do something like a plus b, right? And now you can run your function and pass 1 and 2, and then it will do the work. So that will be one thing it needs to do when it comes to pure functions. So this would be pure function. So reducers are pure functions. Another point about reducers is number 2. So you could say given the same input, it must output the same content, let's say. So for this example, it always has to output 1 plus 2. It always has to output 3. If it outputs like, let's say something like 4, then you have a problem. It's not a pure function anymore. And one way you could do is, let's say this is like this is like a var, and here you changed it. You said something like 1 is equal to 2, and now the problem comes. Now this is referencing outside, and it is not. It's not in here, and it's in here, but it's also referenced outside, and that's confusing. So what you need to have is you need to make sure that it outputs the same thing every time you give one something. So that's pure function in basically a as an example. Okay, let's go back to here and close this. So reducer functions, they take two things, two parameters, right? They take the current state, the state that we're in right now, and they take action. So those are the two things that they take. So the current state and the action, and then it does its work, and then it returns a new state. So if there is any change to the state, then it returns the current state. If there is no change, if there is a change, it returns a new state. If there is no change, it returns the current state. So it's basically a logical thing that basically tells you here is you gave me something. If there is a change to it, I'll compare those two things. If there is a difference, then I will give you a new state. If there is no difference, I'll give you the old state. All right, so let's see kind of like the project we're going to be working on today. So in this project, it's basically a simple React project. We have app.js, right? And then we have the title, which is a component. And the component, the title has a lot of things in here. But all it does is basically when I click this, you could edit the title. You could say, Gibby School update, and it updates the title. And you could click that, and then you could update it here. Hello students, right? Update it, boom, it updates. So it's basically an edit title thing, right? So we have a couple of states here. We have the title state, which has as a default hello people, the editing state, which is by default false. So in here in our JSX, we have let me just make sure we toggle wrap. In our JSX, we have a ternary operator, which basically when the editing is true, it basically shows this. So this icon. So we have just an icon here. And when the editing is true, it's false, it shows this data. So that's what it does, basically. So that sets it's a set false. So by default it's false. If you click it, now it's true, and if you click update, then it's false, right? So that's all it does. So as you can see here, when we click edit, it shows the button, this button, and it shows the data. And then when we hit update, which is this button is update, then it goes back to false, which shows that icon. Okay, and then the last one is basically the new title text, basically. So this text is the new title, right? So it's basically what you already have in your state. If you have nothing in your state, then it's not going to show anything. All right, so that's generally our app. We have this function that handles basically the change. So every time there's a change, it keeps track of whatever you write here, right? So that's what it does, the handle change. So that is our component. What we need to do is we need to use the reducer function to manage the state, right? We want to manage this state using the reducer function instead of our normal function. So we're going to use something called UseReduce, and we're going to go and read about it. UseReducer. It's a hook. So every time we use a hook, we have to Google it. UseReducer is right here, and it's one of the hooks. So there's a lot of hooks here. So these are the basic ones you guys have seen, and we have UseReducer here. So if we click it, it takes us to here. It says here, let's read about it. As I can see here, it has something called state and dispatch, and then it has a reducer initial argument and something like that. So it says an alternative to use state. So it's an alternative to use state. So instead of using use state, you use UseReducer. Accepts a reducer type. So it accepts a state and action. Okay, and then it returns a new state and returns a current state paired with a dispatch. So it returns the current state paired or connected with a dispatch method. Okay. UseReduce usually preferable to the use state when you have a complex state logic that involves multiple sub-values, or when the next state depends on the previous one. UseReducer also lets you optimize performance component that triggers deep updates because you can pass dispatch down instead of callbacks. So basically what this is saying is UseReducer is best when you have a large and complex application or an app. The reason for that is it keeps track of the previous state and the next state. I mean, the previous state and the current state, and you will not have a side effect. So the reason for that, the reason we use UseReducer is that. So let's go back to our example. So our example, we want to replace these two with UseReducer, using the UseReducer method. So what we need to do is we need to create the reducer function. So remember that we talked about the pure function of reducer. We need to create that pure function, right? So let's do that. So let's say const, let's call it reducer, and then this will be an arrow function. So just a simple arrow function. And we created this right above our components, the title. So in this, we need to pass two things. We need to pass the state, and also we need to pass action. We'll talk about what the action is. The state is your current state. So whatever you have here, that will be your state. So in here, we need to make sure that, so in state, okay, let me go back in a second. And actually, let's leave this as empty for now. And let's comment out these two, because we want to replace these two with UseReducer. So let's set up the UseReducer in here. So UseReducer, we're going to say UseReducer. It takes the reducer function, right? So this reducer function we just created, reducer, if I spell it correctly, reducer, and also it takes the initial state. So the initial state for this one, so for the title, the initial state would be the hello people, and for the editing, the initial state will be false, right? So we need to create initial state. So let's actually create initial state here. So we're going to say const, let's call it just initial state. This would be just an object, so it would not be a function. Initial state. This spelling is not correct. Initial state to be just an object. So this object will have the title, which had hello people. So we're just gonna set that to the title, hello people. And then it had the editing, and the editing will originally be false, right? So that will be our initial state. So we just need to pass this initial state to our UseReduce we just created. So this is our UseReduce. So we need to pass those two things. So we need to pass a function and initial state, right? But we need to also set it to our we need to set it to a state. So right here, where we saw the example, we have to set it to an array with state and also a dispatch. And we'll talk about what the dispatch is. The state is basically just our current state, right? So we're going to say here const state and then dispatch. Don't worry about the dispatch now. We'll talk about what it is in a minute, right? If I spell everything correctly. Okay, dispatch. So now let's actually console log the state. This is state. Let's see what that is. State, right? We're gonna have issues here because we actually took out the state, our original state. But let's see what this is. So our state would be this. So this is our state. It's hello people and false. So title. So just our initial state. That's our state right now. Okay. So we are good in that. Next thing is we need to work on our reducer function, right? So our reducer function, we want to make sure that we use this action. We want to make sure we use this action to make sure that we basically create a whenever we change something or the state changes, we want to send it this what do you call parameter. We want to use this parameter to change the state, right? So that's what we're using. So action has two things, right? So if we go back to here, let's see if they're explaining here. They're not explaining it. So action has two things, right? Let me just, I don't know if you want to use this, but let me just go to a new one. New one? No. Okay. Whatever. Let me just undo everything. Or we could just do a new one right here. Close it. New. So action. Okay. Action. Action is the second parameter for the reducer function. So one was the state, and we talked about the state. It's your current state. So right now, our current state is just basically hello world and false. That's our current state. But the action, okay. So the action needs two things. One is a must, and the other one is optional. It needs something called type, and then it needs a. So this is the must one. So you need to have this one. Usually, when you create a type, it's a string, and it's also capital. So it's something like, let's say, something like toggle. So it's all capital, toggle with the G, right? It's all capital, and it's a string, right? So type is always a, it's always a string. It also needs some data. So basically, what are you saying here is the type of thing that I want to change is the toggle. But what do I change the state to? So the reducer function is asking you, okay, you ask us to change something, right? That's great. But what are we changing it to, right? So that's where the something called payload comes. Payload. So payload is the data. Is the, you don't have to call it payload. That's how they, that's how the React community or Redux community calls it. So it's, you kind of like, most of the time you have to call it payload, because most of the projects that you will see, they'll call it payload. So, and also this one, it doesn't have to be capital, all of it. This is just a convention. This is how you know this is a type of action. So payload would be whatever, the state. So whatever you want to change it to. So this would be like the input. So this would be the input from your form. So input. So this would be a input, data. This would be data. It could be a Boolean. So it could be false, true, whatever. It could be something. So now let's actually, just for now, let us create a basic, let's create a basic thing. So in general, when you're using a reducer function, you use a switch statement. So I don't know if you guys have seen the switch when we were doing JavaScript. So a switch is just like a if statement, right? So it's just like an if statement. Give me a second. Can you guys hear me? Oh, sorry. My code sandbox said it's inactive. I thought my internet went away. Let me know if you guys can hear me. I think my internet is fine from what I see. Hamid, can you hear me? I think Zakir is in here too. You guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. I had a connection issue at the beginning, so I was worried that my internet went away. So, so the reducer function. Okay, so we need to use a switch statement. So switch statement, in general, a switch statement is, let's see. So let's close this. Let's change the colors. So let's create a line here. So a switch statement is an if statement basically, but written in a different way. So if somebody haven't seen a switch statement or a switch, then this is how it's written. Usually you will start with the word switch, if I can spell it, and then you give it a condition. So here's like just an if statement condition. So you'll say something like, so we will say something like action type. So we'll say whatever action type we want to run. And then we will say, okay, if the action type is, and then here's a curly bracket. If the action type is, and then we use something called case. So case is just like else, right? In the switch thing. So we'll say case, if the action type is, let's say, toggle. So we'll write exactly how it's written in our in our type here. If that's the case, then you say you run something here. If that's not the case, and then you write another case here. But you always have to have a default case here at the end. The default case is basically whatever. If all these cases are not true, then this is the true, right? So let's use a switch. So we'll say switch here, and then we will say action.type. So basically, here's what we're saying is if the action.type is, then we'll start with the case. So we'll say, usually what I do is I start with like the default case. So I say, I don't even write the case, I say default. Then the default, if all the cases that we're gonna write, if they're not true, then just to return the state, right? Return the current state. So this is the state. So on top of the default, we say case. The first case would be a, let's call it toggle editing. So toggle editing would be if we toggle the editing. So if we toggle the button, then basically return. Okay, so we're gonna say return. Let's return. First, we're gonna copy the state. So remember about the immutability that we talked about. So if you're changing something, the first thing you need to do is you need to copy the state, right? The current state. And then actually, let's just remove this. We don't need that. So we need to copy the state, right? And then we're gonna say if the toggle, the edit toggle is if that's the case, then we will say editing, turn it into a true or false. So if we want to change it to true or false, we could use the opposite of whatever we have. So we're gonna say state.editing. Remember, remember here when we were console logging the state, it gave us right here, it gave us the editing and title. So that's our state. So instead of having here editing, we could just say here state.editing, and we could have here title, we could have state.title, right? And we see our thing, right? So the button and all that stuff is not working because we need to change this on click in a little bit. So now, if the action type is toggle editing, then run this code. Basically, copy the current state, and then if it's false, change it to true. If it's true, change it to false. Right? You could also hard code here and say change it to true. But then later on, if it's true, you cannot change it back to false. So you could use the opposite right here. You could create another case. You could say case. Let's say if we want to change the title, we say edit, and you could name this whatever you want. You could just say title if you want here. Always keep it in capital letters, because that's kind of like how you know this is a type, action type, right? So let's say edit title. If you want to change the edit title, we'll say return. Of course, what is the first thing we need to do if we want to change something? What is the first thing? What do you guys think?
Switch.
The first step of changing the state. What do we do?
We're gonna copy the state.
Copy this state. Okay, so copy the current state, and now we run our change. So we say, okay, we have our original state. Now let's add something to it. So what we add in here is the title. So we're changing the title. So the title, we can just hard code it right now. So instead of hello people, let's say hello students. All right, we're gonna hard code it now, but we're gonna change it later in a minute. Okay, so now this will not change it, because if we want to change this, we need to like click a button, right? We need to click this button, or we need to do something. So right now our problem is we cannot change it directly something. So if we click, we're gonna have an issue. The reason for that is set editing, which is a how to change the state, which is right here. We commented that out, so we can't use this set editing. Cannot use that at all. So what we need to use is we need to use this method dispatch. Dispatch, think of it as like the tracking company. So I think Mohammed is working in dispatching, maybe. I don't know if you're working in dispatching, but
Yeah, I do.
yeah, you work in dispatch. Okay, so dispatch, this exact word is the same as like in tracking, unlike any other place. So you send in something, like you dispatching something. So what we sending is the action. We send in an action, and we're saying, hey, send an action. Okay, so now here we're gonna call that dispatch here. Dispatch. So we're gonna call that function, this dispatch function. This is already built in the UseReducer. So what it does is it takes it needs one thing to start with, which is the type. It needs a type. So it needs a type, and then if you want to change to something else, they say it needs a payload, right? So we're gonna start with, and also it has to be an object. So whatever you change in something to, you change in the state, this state. So we change the title now. We're not changing the title. We're changing the editing. So we're changing the editing to true. So to do that, we need to first thing we need to do is the type, right? So object here, we say type. And what was the type for the editing? Who remembers the type for the editing? So what word are we going to use when we want to send an action for editing?
I remember you put in the picture in the drawing, but I can't recall.
So in here, so everything is in this reducer function. So we have actions here, right? So these are the actions we're sending. So the first one is a toggle editing. The second one is edit title. So those are two things we need to use. So now we're doing the editing. So we use this one. So the word we're going to use is toggle editing, right? So we're going to copy the toggle editing, and we're going to give it to the dispatch. So where is the dispatch we're editing? So yeah, dispatch. So the dispatch, we're telling it, okay, the type we want to send is toggle editing, okay? So we're saying, okay, target, go to the switch statement, and then find the case that says toggle editing. So this is the case that says toggle editing. And then, so that's all we're doing right now for this one. The reason for that is because this one is just a reverse. So it basically, whenever you run this, it either says false or true, and the default is false, right? So now the toggle should work. I'm not sure if it's going to give us an error. So let's save this and toggle it. Right. So it works. The toggle works for us because we send a dispatch with the toggle editing type, and then the dispatch went into the reducer function, and it said, I need a function, I need an action with the name toggle editing. Then let's run whatever is in there. So it ran this, it returned this, and this basically did the opposite. So it did basically it was false, so it made it true. So that's what it did. Now we cannot do this because we didn't actually do anything with the title. So we didn't target the edit title. So that's what we need to do next is target the edit title, right? So edit title case. And there's another, there's a button here that we're gonna do. So this button has two things. It has a set title and it has a set editing. So we need to set the editing false. So we cannot use this because we already basically got rid of that. So here we're going to use the dispatch again. Dispatch. So what do we need to pass in dispatch? What is it an array? Is it what are we passing in dispatch? What do you guys think?
Object.
Object, yeah. So we pass in an object. Always you pass an object in dispatch. So in this object, we need to pass two things. We need to pass two things. One would be, so what is the first thing we need to pass? What is something that's must to pass in dispatch? What's one thing?
Edit on that toggle.
So in here we said an action. So yeah, so I didn't explain it correctly, but in here, dispatch must have a type, right? It has to have a type. If it doesn't have a type, it will not work. But it doesn't have to have a payload, right? Payload is an option. So let me actually draw that. Let me get rid of this and do a quick drawing. So dispatch need to have one thing. Dispatch. It's just like an action. It needs to have must is type, right? It needs to have a type. But then optional is a payload. So sometimes you could have a payload, sometimes it might not. So payload is basically if you want to change it, the content of your UI, your component, then you have to have a payload. So whatever you want to change it to. But now, actually, in our switch statement, we already gave the title something that's hard coded. So there's some of the ways to change the state is by hard coding it, or we can pass it through payload. So those are the two ways to change it. So now all we need to do here is we need to just pass the type now, and then you will see it will change it to the hard coded. So type. What is the type we're going to change it to? What type are we passing if we want to change the title?
Edit title.
Edit title, yep. So edit title is the type we need to pass. So right here, and it has to be a string. So make sure it's a string, right? So now if we just click update title without writing anything, it should change it to this hard-coded thing. But we also want to see the editing icon thing, right? So we could also go here and say editing, change it to false, right? Because we want to see that. So now if we update it, it says hello students, and we see the icon here, right? That's what we're looking for basically. But now if we go back and we put something in there, it will still say hello students, right? Because right now we're not passing any payload. We're not sending any data here. So the next thing we need to send is the payload, right? So the payload is whatever data we want to change it to. And that would be, we have a state here that helps us with that. So this is state. We need to, the new title is what we need to send. So new title here. And also it's right here. So this is the value right here. So that's what we're sending. So this will be whatever we type in here will be payload. So in here, instead of the hard coded, we can say state dot title, right? State dot title, and that will be right here. So this would be the state dot title. So now if we go ahead and edit, as you can see, that will be our state. And hi guys, update. It didn't change, right? So now we have a problem actually. Let's see. So where's the problem coming from? So dispatch payload. Oh, okay. We need to pass a payload, right? Somewhere. So let's pass, we need to have a payload. So actually not a title. It will say here, we have, the action has the payload for us. So not the state. So the action has the payload. And the way to know that is by actually console logging the action. We could try that. Let's actually put here let's just put test here and console log the action, right? So if we console log action and then we click here, let's clear our, can I clear this? Let's clear our console, run this. As you can see, now it says, hi guys. And if we update, if we say update, it should show us this hi guys data. It shows us, yeah. So this is the payload. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for the type edit title, and the payload is hi guys. So now in here, we need to change the here to action dot payload, right? Come on. So now that's what's in there, and we could change this to whatever update title that changes to the payload. So that's our payload right now. So action has two things, type and payload. That's what you need to keep in mind always. Okay, so dispatch works with the action. It sends an action, and it needs an object. It could have a type only, or it could have a type and payload. Those are two things you need to understand. This payload could be anything. If we put a string here, we say payload test. Then now, whenever we change this update, it changes to payload test, right? So that's what it has. So we could say here, we could set to the state. All right. Any questions right now? We learned a lot. Any questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
So this reducer mainly deals with the data of objects. Like, what about if there is arrays or something like that?
So yeah, so it deals with the state. So usually your state is an object most of the time. So if it's an array, then you put it inside an object. So you start with an object. So let's say this data is an array, then you put it inside an object. So this would be something like that. So if you have that, then of course this has to be each one of them has to be an object. So so if you want to have, this would be an object, this would be an object, or you can put both of them in an object, another object. So you'll have an object within, you'll have an array within an object, and then you have other objects. So that would be one way to do it. If that's the case, then all you have to do is just, you have to drill down. You have to say something like state that, I mean, you could loop through it within, outside, and then you could get a new, what do you call, a new object. So you could use a mapping, you could map through it, and then that would be your initial state. So if you have a complex data, then you have to map over it and have something that you could work with, right? So when you have an array always, you have to, and you have a multiple object within that array, then you have to loop through it, right? That's the only way to kind of grab from that data. So you could do your own looping, and that would be your initial state, right? So, but in the reducer, you always reference the new state like that, like this. But this comes from the reducer here, UseReducer. So UseReducer has a state, and this is what you're referencing here, this is state, right? And UseReducer has initial state. The initial state will be your data, and your data, it doesn't matter how you set it up. If you can set it up like this, it would be good. If not, then make sure to loop through it first, and then make it something like this, right? Any other question? Okay, so the last thing we need to do is, I'm not sure if we even gonna do this, is to take this reducer to its own, what do you call it, its own folder. So so basically in here, we could create something like reducers. You will see this a lot. This is the convention, basically. All the reducers, you put them in a separate place. So in here, we're going to create something like index.js and put all reducers here. And also you create a folder for actions. And then in here, you will create a index.js, and you put all your actions here. So now I'll try to divide it. I haven't had a time to make it so that it is it's divided. So our actions, these are our actions. And so these are our actions, the switch statement. But also if you want to divide it, you take this part to the reducers, and you take this part, the case part, to not the case part, I mean the toggle editing part, to the actions. So we don't have a lot of time to go through that. So I can give you example another time. Let's see if I can go through it. I didn't even prepare it, so I don't want to mess it up. Give me a second. Let me see if I can do it. So reducer, okay. Let's see the actions. I wrote it down somewhere, so I want to make sure that it's correctly written. Okay, so this will complicate the thing, because now we have to bring something called mapping something called connect, and something related to Redux. So I want to keep it simple for now. In the homework, you could do it this way if you want. It asks you to divide it into folders. You could do it this way and create your reducer here and your actions inside the reducer. You could do it this way, so this is fine. But I'll go over it. I'll go over the setup of how to make it so that you have these different files another time. Probably in the Redux, but we'll see. The Redux we have to do it this way. We have to divide everything into its own folders. But the reducer function now is basically a simple way to kind of introduce yourself to managing state outside of basically the component. So we're managing our state right here, and we're using UseReducer. Any other question?
So let's say if you go with that way, the last way you're talking about, like when you divide to the action and the reducers, how do you connect them, like between these?
So the way you connect them is you use something called action creator. So there is a function called action creator function, action creators. So action creators are just a function that creates. So this is kind of like an action creator basically. So what it does is it's a function, and then that function just returns the type and the payload, and then you send this function to the reducer, right? So you say, okay, I have a function for you, run this function, and also you will have the state in the reducer, right? So inside the reducer, you will have the current state and initial state. So in here, we'll probably have, we can just write down basically a quick one. So initial state, you copy it, you put it inside here. That will be your initial state. And also before that, you could import your actions here. So you could say here, import actions. So usually the way you import actions is by, let me see. The way you import actions is by just importing as a function, not as like a named named import. So you could say something like here, we'll say, what was some of the, so we'll say toggle editing. So we'll copy here, toggle editing, and then you'll also have here you'll have another one, which is edit title. So that would be edit title here, and then you'll say from, and then this would be actions, and then just the actions. Index will be just the default, so you don't have to worry about it. Now, so this will be initial state. Now you create the reducer function here, which will have the switch statement. So this will be, we'll just copy all this to here. I didn't want it to go through because we have to use something else called Redux, React Redux. We have to import it and stuff. But this is how it's going to look like. I'll go over basically all of it at one time. but you will put your basically your reducer here, and then you export this. Basically, you say export that, and then we're using this, so that's good. And now you create this inside the action. So inside the action, you will create a first thing you will create is just basically a variable. So, and we have to export that variable. Export, let's say const change or change title. Let's say you could also say update title. So this would be edit title, the one we have. This would be the edit title. You could also call this edit title, it's fine. It's always good to call it whatever exactly it is. And here another one you create for the update, do the toggle editing. It's equal to toggle editing. And now here you will create your action creator. So you create another function here. So we get it into Redux. So I don't want to confuse you, but the main thing is you create your action creator here, and then you use the reducer to run this these methods. And yeah, so and then that's how you run it. But main thing you need to understand is just you need to have a reducer function, action state, and then UseReducer dispatch is you connected to all the buttons, and then that's how you update your state. But yeah, I'll explain more on this part of like dividing things, making it so that everything's organized another time. Any other question? Any question you have about this? All right, so let's quickly go over the assignment. I want to finish this before 8:30. So the assignment is to do app. Basically, all you need to do is you need to clone this and then use the React create method. So apex create React, and then this will create the React app for you. CD in there, and then do your thing. In here, these are the minimum viable product. So you need to create an action type called add to do, and then I would say two functions. One to make the to do thing or to do list complete, and the other one to clear it, I think. So those are two things you need to do. And then you could either build a folder for the reducers, or you could just do what we did right now and do it inline. Here's a set up your state, to do toggle, clear, all that stuff on this stage. So create the React app and then set up your folders, your files component. And then I would say create a component called to do, and the other one maybe something like the to do form or something like that. And then kind of like work that way. Any question? You could also look at I think we did other to-dos, or maybe you could Google one and see how it's set up.
Normally, when you're doing the create React app,
yeah,
are you gonna do normally in the VS Code, or you can do the terminal when you're doing the creating?
I would say the terminal is okay. So you open your terminal and then you go to the folder where you have all your like React projects or whatever, CD into that, and then just run this command, npx create React app to do, and then it will create a folder called to do with all the React projects, and then you just CD into that folder and then say npm start, and then that's how you get started with your project. And then clear up the other things like all the default stuff, clean it, and then just you could do CSS if you want, or you could just start with a basic thing where you have like a one input with a button, and then a place for the data to show. And then you could start with like a basic state. So start with your normal state and then convert it to the reducer function, right? You can do that too. Okay, any other question? All right. Okay, I'll see you guys tomorrow if you have any question. Otherwise, inshallah, just try your best. Actually, tomorrow is Saturday, so just keep working. I'll see you on Monday, and we can go over the previous lesson and this lesson on Monday, but try to finish it as soon as you can, inshallah. All right, take care, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.